I actually had the opportunity to go to Philadelphia last week and to speak there. They had a tremendous meeting. It was about 70 people that showed up in the place where they have their offices, which is in a church. And this is after they had a town hall meeting of hundreds of people, and they have another one on Tuesday, which represents the mass uprising that has happened is not just in the streets, but it's in meeting halls and people planning and strategizing about how to continue this movement forward. And the political allies and comrades that we have in Philadelphia are very much in the center of the developments there. But my primary reason for being there was to not only talk about the uprising, but also put it in the context, but talk about the way forward, how to continue forward and to build the mass movement and not let it die in the streets. I think if you look back years ago, if you go back all the way to the Gen 6 when that happened, and if you look at the political actors that were at the fore, they're not the same. I remember when we went to, when President Obama was elected, some of us went to Harlem in front of the Adam Clayton Powell government state headquarters, Harlem office building. And I remember it was one of those days where there was so much energy in the crowd, and there were so many young people, kids, like toddlers to, adolescents and young people. And I remember after the election was finished and the results came in, kids, not just in Harlem, but when I went back to Jersey City, I think I got back around 12 midnight, and there were parents and their little kids running, saying, we did it. And like little babies that were maybe, they were old enough to speak, but a little bit taller than Ciola, saying, we did it. They had this feeling, even though they didn't have an understanding of history, and it was something that they sort of felt that they were able to absorb through their parents, and it was a moment for them. So that was 2008. A lot of those young people, the people who weren't old enough to vote, some of them have graduated high school now. Some of them are coming into adulthood. And the ones that were able to vote, and it was their first time casting the vote in bourgeois elections, they're in their mid-20s now. But if you look at that particular time, there was a mass outpouring of oppressed youth in the streets in response to the Obama presidency. We understand, and we understood then, there were some who were so much in a rush. Is Daddy funny? You laughing at me? They were so much in a rush to attack the presidency without understanding the long historical process through which black people came and having a nuanced way of looking at things. He was going to take the highest seat in the predominant imperialist nation in the world. And it's not like the bourgeoisie allows someone who is outside of their sphere of influence to take that seat. He was very much groomed for it. You remember in 2004 when he gave that talk at the Democratic National Convention? Most people who had their thinking caps on were like, oh, they've run out of options now. Things are so bad that they are going to put a black person in office. They've lost so much political capital that this is the way that they're headed, this is where they're going. And so he was very much groomed for it. All the backers had lined up behind him on Wall Street. They were preparing him after 8 years of the ineloquence and doltishness of Bush. You had to go the other direction. Not just someone who was actually intelligent or was able to speak well, but someone who was black. Because they wanted to get that political, see, we're not so bad. See, we elected a black person, we ain't so bad. But we understood what his role would be. And if you watched his presidency, he was able to do things that George Bush could not get done at the end of his presidency. He was able to bomb Libya. They have troops in Nigeria now and in Central Africa and Uganda, so-called chasing down a low Republican army, whatever, at the LRA. They have a base, which has actually been there for a while, for AFRICOM in Djibouti. It's hard to tell exactly how many soldiers they actually have in Africa. It's at least 1,000, special forces mostly. They were able to take the war in Afghanistan and expand it into Pakistan. They've started this whole drone warfare. They've bombed Somalia with drones. They've bombed Yemen. They've bombed Pakistan. They've expanded the war in a way that the Bush regime could not have done so. And they were also to stave off a complete collapse of the financial markets. So a lot of those young people that voted for him or were too young to vote, and their entire lives have been, their entire cognitive life has been the however many years of Obama's presidency, 6 years of Obama's presidency. And so they hopefully have developed an understanding that though President Barack Obama may look like us, he does not represent the interests of the oppressed people in the United States. He does not represent the interests of black people or of Latino immigrants or indigenous people or white workers even. And that's sort of funky when you get to it, because if you look at the precipitous decline in his support after he made those statements regarding Skip Gates, it's like a lot of that young, hipsterish, white backing sort of was like, well, wait a second. We didn't buy into that. That whole going against cops thing, that's not something that we're for. And talking about racism, that's not what we want. We're post-racial. Why are you talking about racism? That's not your job. But a lot of people are beginning to awaken to the nature of his presidency. And the simple fact of the matter is that it's not about faces. It's about function. A little bit of it is about faces, and some of the civil rights movement, liberation movement, was about actually having representation. But that was a small part of it. Because the fact of the matter is that the capitalist system remains intact, and that the political superstructure is there to help keep it intact, and to sometime make concessions when they can't continue without making concessions in order to keep the capitalist system going. And though President Barack Obama has made some very nice statements regarding Trayvon Martin, regarding Eric Garner and Mike Brown, which there's been a lot of contradictory statements, the primary reason for the state to exist is to maintain the status quo. It's a tool of repression, of class oppression, to keep the rule of one class over another. That's its primary function in society. No matter how the superstructure might change and what laws might come in, it still has a primary role to maintain the order as it exists today. Even if we're able to get some changes in laws, it's still going to be that today. It doesn't mean that there should not be a struggle regarding some of those changes, but we have to understand in the midst of that struggle to develop the understanding, the political education of people who are in the struggle. Because if we don't, and the system is left to stand, and the state apparatus is continually, as things continue to get worse, is going to get more brutal, more militarized, and we can't hope that these will be the last killings that unfortunately will happen to people in oppressed communities. You remember Rodney King in 1992, the tremendous outpouring, the LA Rebellion, but it's not as if it stopped in 1992. It's not as if when people rose up regarding the incarceration of the Gen 6, that mass incarceration of oppressed people, particularly black people, has stopped. It hasn't even slowed down. Michael Bell, one of the young men, was in prison of the Gen 6. It was just a brief hiccup and then it continued on. So then what would our tasks be? First, I think it's important for us to put it in the context of, to understand Ferguson and what's actually happening, not just in the political superstructure, but in the lives of oppressed people around the country. I gave a talk a while ago, and I'm going to rehash a little bit about the conditions that create Ferguson, and it's important to talk about those because it's happening all across the country. The conditions that created Ferguson are happening in Detroit. It's actually much more severe in Detroit. They're happening in Baltimore, they're happening in Philadelphia, they're happening in Newark, they're happening in every major metropolitan area. If we go back in history and look at how most of these areas, especially in the Rust Belt, were created, they were created because black people were fleeing the repression in the South. They were fleeing the semi-feudal conditions that existed in the South, of sharecropping laws, peonage laws, the black codes, and all those things that existed to keep slavery in a new way in place. And there was also a shortage at that time because of World War I and World War II and labor, so black people began migrating to the North to get jobs in factories. It's hard for us to pick a time in history when deindustrialization began because, you know, the capitalist class is always revolutionizing the means of production constantly so they can increase their bottom line. But most of us know it really picked up in the late 70s. And the people that were the first fired because of technology and because of the shipping of capital overseas were the most oppressed, were black people. In cities like Buffalo, cities like Milwaukee, where I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, and Detroit, and Toledo, and Johnstown, all these cities that were major manufacturing areas that extended from upstate New York all the way to Milwaukee, as far south as St. Louis, Missouri. Even though if you look at the actual, what the historians call the Rust Belt, it's actually a smaller area, but the industrial sector stretched much longer than they will actually give it. And when I was growing up, the thing that a lot of black parents who worked in the factories, my parents worked in the factories, were telling us as we got older is to take the civil servants test. They say, go get that government job because the factory jobs aren't going to be around longer. And so that's what happened. And so you have a lot of people in the public sector that are women and are oppressed people, especially black people. So not only were we cast off because of the capitalist mode of production and deindustrialization at that time, but when people went into these public sector jobs, we're now seeing a shrinking of the public sector and an attack on the public sector. We're used to, when we think of neoliberalism, of pointing to other parts of the world, but this is neoliberalism in the center of imperialism. It's the attack, it's the right-to-work laws that was passed in Michigan, it's the anti-union laws that were passed in Wisconsin that led to the uprising and the seizing of the Madison State Capitol building, and the laws were passed in Indiana and other states, and laws that are on the books that they're trying to get out of committee so they can be voted on, that are to curtail workers' rights to organize and defend their interests and attack the public sector. And the people that are most harmed and affected by that are black people and other oppressed people and women. This is happening right alongside of the attack against public education, the privatization or charterization, which is really the same thing because it allows for, you know, so-called nonprofits or for-profit companies to write their own charter for schools and to get their hands on the massive billions of dollars that is spent on public education in this country. And schools have remained segregated, whether it's by law, now it's more de facto, but they remain segregated, but this will only increase segregation. And if you go to most areas, I will use Northeast Denver, which is where Clarence was actually living. Northeast Denver, which is where black people had concentrated themselves in 5 Points and Park Hill. It's predominantly black. Park Hill, not so much anymore. It used to be when black people first started moving in, is the meat packing plants were in downtown Denver, and you could catch a train. I think the tracks are still there. You can catch a train from 5 Points to downtown Denver, get a job in the meat packing plants. And there was a street called Race Street, which was the farthest east that you can go. That was the dividing line. You couldn't go any farther east than Race Street, or you would risk being assaulted or attacked. There was actually a black town in Denver called Deerfield, Colorado, which exists as a monument now. There's still some buildings standing. And Deerfield, Colorado began to die off as people moved into the city to get the jobs in the meatpacking plants and some of the other industries that existed in Colorado. Colorado was built around mining But there was also, it's a major meat packing place in the Denver area, which is now moved to Greeley. But the schools in Northeast Denver, the way that it started is they closed down elementary schools and reopened them as charters, and the student population was based off of a lottery, then the middle schools, and then the high schools, and they all became charters. Monica was talking about the school walkouts in Denver. It used to be that the primarily black schools were GW, George Washington, East High School, and Manual High School. But now, if you look at the pictures, you'll see a lot of black students in North and South, because those were the students that used to go to Manual, that would have gone to Manual, that were dispersed throughout the metropolitan area outside of their neighborhoods. It changed the entire makeup of Northeast Denver to where 5 Points now has been built up. They've built huge condominiums and established minimum income requirements, and the people are no longer, it's mainly middle-class white people that had left the inner city areas in the 70s and moved to the outskirts and like Cherry Hills and Cherry Creek and areas like that are now moving back into the inner city areas. And in order to, not only did we have the neoliberal attack on the public sector and in specific neighborhoods, but in order to get people to move in, they had to institute what they call quality of life ordinances, which are these repressive measures to scare people into leaving to where they don't feel safe. One of those, which Bratton initiated here in New York from a policy written by this guy named James Wilson, who used to work under the Reagan administration, was broken windows. Broken windows was neighborhood specific. It started in Northeast Denver, and then it started moving around in other areas. Then it moved around in Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill was a upper middle class place, but it had the longest road in all of Colorado that went through Capitol Hill, called Colfax. And because of that, you had a lot of homeless, oppressed people that would travel Colfax and be on Capitol Hill. And because East High School, which is sort of in the center of the city, not quite, but it's 65-70% black, and then it has a lot of white students, and it has a good sports program. It's known for that, and good academics. And so it draws students from, because of where it is, you can have students from Capitol Hill that are white and Northeast Denver that are black that go to it. But because those students walk down Colfax, they instituted broken windows policing to scare people and to rid the homeless population. Most of the homeless are black and indigenous. After they kicked indigenous people off of their lands in Colorado, and they moved into the main city, which is Denver. And I lived in Capitol Hill, so I was a witness to some of the repressive measures. You know, how they would bring in these paddy wagons and police, and they would swoop down and start rounding kids up. And that sort of ramped up this whole process of changing the demographics and making that area for other people who had left it years ago. This is the same process that created Ferguson, that people in the city of St. Louis, went through this whole process of gentrification and neoliberal attack on the public sector and on education, and it forced them to move to this area, which had been predominantly white and middle to upper middle class, but is now black and has a high unemployment rate, and I think 25% of people live below poverty rate, and I think it was like 45% live below twice the poverty rate in the Ferguson area. There's been a great increase of poverty in suburban areas. It's not, some of it has to do with white people becoming poor because they lost their jobs, but that's just like a small fraction of it. Most of it is people who are kicked out of the city centers and moved to the suburban areas. That represents the largest, by far, percentage of the growth of poverty in the suburban areas because of the changing demographics in the city and in the suburban areas. This is all part of the capitalist system. It's part of this whole attack on the public sector. It's part of the financial institutions and the banks indebting, robbing the treasury and indebting the cities and states and the federal government. And you have situations like that which exist in Detroit, where they're attacking workers' pensions, they're selling off public assets, and they're trying to shrink the city and turn whole neighborhoods into wooded areas, into forests, or urban farming so they can shrink the city even less than it has already shrunk because of the decline in factory jobs and the housing crisis that so drastically affected oppressed people, especially in the Detroit area. And we can expect this to continue. And that's part of it's that, along with the rising spheres of influence, the rising spheres that are independent, from the imperialist grasp. You have countries that are developing their own power, countries like India. You have China, you have Russia even, that are seeking independence from the U.S. China's always been independent since the revolution from the U.S. in the Western world, but other countries that are more and more breaking from the imperialist mode. And this creates difficulties for not just the U.S., but also the Western world. They've also seen that despite their most technologically advanced equipment, they can't subdue nations of oppressed people. They weren't able to do it in Iraq. They haven't been able to do it in Libya. They haven't been able to do it in Afghanistan. So this has a major effect on their ability to continue to rob and pillage oppressed people around the world, as well as the fact that the capitalist system continues to teeter. If you look at the financial news, you see every day with someone with a prediction saying that we're near collapse. We're not out of the woodwork. Don't forget about the information regarding employment figures. I can tell you, it's all smoke and mirrors. A lot of it has to do with the fact that people have dropped out of they're no longer counted. They dropped out of what is the word I'm looking for? The labor force altogether. People who've been unemployed for 2-3 years can't find a job. Doesn't matter their training, their schooling, or anything, they can't find a job, and so they don't count them. And so they will say, oh, well, the employment rate has gone down to 5.8%, but that does not count the amount of people who are underemployed because they can't find a full-time job, and those who are discouraged workers who've dropped out of the labor force altogether. This is where the capitalist system is. So this is why it's important for the Homeland Security and Pentagon to have these monies set aside to continually arm the police forces around the country. It wouldn't make sense for a city of 27,000 people to have LRAD devices or tanks or armored personnel carriers. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? For them to receiving training from Israel or U.S. Special Forces, what are they preparing for? They're preparing for exactly what is happening now. That's why they were able to move so quickly and establish martial law in Ferguson. And before they actually officially established it, it existed through no-fly zones. Before they announced it and saying we're establishing martial law and curfew, in practice, it had already existed there. This is a testing ground for them. And I think as young people, many of them are young people who voted for Obama or who weren't old enough to vote and who are excited about him. Those are a lot of the young people that are in the streets today. And they're receiving their education. And they're learning more about, they may not call it the state, but they're learning more and beginning to see through their practice of struggle that, wait a second, they were never designed to serve and protect us. They're only there to keep us in line. And it's important as revolutionaries for us to continue to be out there in the movement and to continue to help that political development so that the movement can continue forward. We don't know exactly how far it's going to go, where it's going exactly at this point. That's one of the beauties of it. It's exciting because we just don't know. When it seems like, people have sort of been in the streets and maybe they're wearing down, then something else happens. Just to remind them. Look at how many people have been killed since they refused to indict Pantaleo. Tamir Rice, just a brother in Florida just 2 days ago, Akai Gurley. And it's just amazing that the system is, it's the system itself, but it's the fact that you can't count I mean, the fact that people were surprised about McCulloch doing the thing he did, but they didn't want to put a cop on trial to question him. They could not allow that to happen. That's why the indictment process was so much different than what you can expect. If we commit a crime, we're not going to get a chance to testify, and they're not going to enter any evidence that we have or alibis or none of that. You just hear their side of the story, we'll get indicted, and that's it. That process that happened with the cop who killed Mike Brown is not a normal process for indictments, not by any stretch of the imagination. But as the movement goes forward, and I'll begin to wind up now because she's ready to go, I think that what we have raised here in New York is the call for a tribunal. We had started this process of calling for the building of people's power assemblies. It's something that Sam Marcy had tried to initiate after the LA Rebellion. Other organizations and groups out of the U.S. Social Forum have tried to initiate it. You know, you have the Jackson People's Assembly in Jackson, Mississippi, and there's different forms of it. You have one in Richmond, Virginia, the Virginia People's Assembly. There's different forms of it, around the country. But what we mean by it, is it's not only a place for people to go and have their voices heard, but it's also an organizing body for which we continue to organize going forward in the political struggle. It's a way to deepen the political consciousness of working and oppressed people. It's a way to continue to organize and to build an independent power at a very root level in the struggle, because that's exactly what is needed. There's something that happens when people are in struggle against the state, and it's happened in Ferguson, and it's happened in many other places where people are up against the state. It happens out of necessity. When you see the primary function of the state and not the other functions of it that were won through struggle, but you see the primary function of it, which is to be repressive, then the needs of people are met through an assembly process. People get together. People who can't move, they find a way to feed people who don't, or to house people who have no food and who have no housing. You need childcare. Through this whole process of people struggling and fighting against the system, they're able to solve these problems. And it's happened in Ferguson. The only way that the Montgomery boycott was able to survive and people were able to get to work is a similar type situation that existed. Without it, they would have had a hard time to continue to resist in Montgomery. Without this sort of necessary body that arises that begins to sort of be parallel to the functions that the state is supposed to provide other than its primary role, which is to be repressive. What we mean is for it to be more deliberate. And we don't need the police in our communities. And whatever antisocial behavior that may arise in an antisocial society, the people can handle those situations. Whatever needs that can be met, the people can pull their resources in and meet those needs. It is not so we can exist parallel. That was one of the failings of Occupy Wall Street. Some people really thought that they could exist parallel to repressive apparatus until they were smashed by the state. The idea is to build up the struggle, build up the confidence, and to continue to be agitational until the mood is at such a point that you begin to rival the state, to where you take on a position of having a dual power. We're not anywhere close to that. But that's the idea of where we want to head. That's sort of what developed in the eastern part of the Ukraine, in the Donbass region. That's how they've been able to fight the Ukrainian military and to fight them off and to fight them on even terms. And that's different. The Ukrainian military doesn't have all the repressive technology that the U.S. has, but the thing about technology is you can't keep it out of the hands of the people. People can build their own drones now. You have countries that are doing it. You can buy drones on Amazon if you want to. I mean, you can't keep it out. You have Anonymous can shut down whole government systems. They can shut down the Defense Department. They can shut down Oakland Police Department. They can shut down BART. Whenever they are aroused, they just make it happen. And that's the thing about technology, is that it evens the playing field a little bit more than it was before. So what we're calling for is a tribunal on police killings, but I think we can actually go farther than that. The people who suffered from Hurricane Sandy are still suffering today. Workers who work in the service sector who receive low wages, it could be a place where they can come and bring their struggles, and we can link the struggles against state repression and against the bosses who don't even want to give even the slightest of raises or allow any organization of workers on the jobs in the service sector. It can be a place where people who have inadequate housing. You heard the other day that the city of New York is selling off some of its public housing units or leasing them to private companies, and we see the writing on the wall. What that actually means going forward is they're going to, it's funny, like rich people, they will take, I've seen they've taken jails, county jails, and refurbished them and made them into condominiums. That's what they're thinking about, like, that's how they want to change the public housing, is they think, oh, look at that building, it's so tall and beautiful, imagine what we can do, and developers will move in and they'll change everything. They did it in New Orleans, Chicago, anywhere you can name, many other places where they've done that. So this opens us up to give people a place to speak their bitterness, to speak the suffering that happens to them, but also begin to plan a way forward and to unify groups in the oppressed community, but also to unify the left. That's the last part that it has not happened. You have the young people that are energized and are being politicized because of the state repression and because of they're seeing the system for what it is, but the left has yet to build unity. We're sort of left behind, and without unity, people aren't going to take leadership when they see left fighting and things of that nature. We've always been for it, but some organizations don't quite play the same way that we do. But I think through this process, we can begin to build that unity. And if not through the leadership and from the working file from some of these organizations who actually want to be honest and want to have unity and want to find a way to struggle forward. So that's the idea that it's in its infancy form of building it. We have a lot of people that have signed on to help build it, and I think that we don't have a time span for when it's actually going to happen. That's something that's very much in the process, but I look to it as being our first real People's Assembly in New York City, and I think that will bode well for the struggle in the future, where we can begin to mobilize and to organize actually people in the community so that they can feel that if the system refuses to listen to them and even has the slightest law change, you have a place that you can go. And the worst thing that could happen is for people to be demobilized and taken out of the streets. And the way to continue guaranteeing that people will be in the streets is if people can come together and strategize and organize together and actually have a plan going forward and are able to educate themselves about what they're really up against. So that's the process we're beginning talking about, and I hope that many comrades see this as, if you feel marginally attached, it's a time to come back in the fold and find a way for us to make this tribunal a success and to draw in all oppressed communities and other working people, and so that this can be our real People's Assembly, and so it would bode well for the struggle going forward. So I got to get that baby home now. So thank you for listening. All power to the people.